What's up, people? What's happening? Hatman Strikes Back, Daily Boxing News, another live stream. Shout out to everybody in the chat. Hope you're all feeling good. We got a couple things to talk about. In fact, I'm going to call this a geriatric edition because we'll be talking about a lot of OAPs in this live stream. A lot of OAPs have apparently got beef with each other in the boxing world. We'll start off talking about Butterbean calling out John Fury. But before we get to that, big up Mr. Luca for the super chat. Early, much appreciated. He says, for Usyk to be the GOAT, he'd have needed more names and styles. People like Ruiz, Sanchez, Caballero, Wilder, Zhang, and Bacoli. Absolutely, yes. Because, as I've said previously, I don't personally judge who the GOAT is based upon who I think would beat who in a fantasy matchup, because that's too subjective. I have to primarily base it on their resume. And part of resume isn't just big names, it's also longevity. Because you might have had a style that was good enough to beat the big names during your time, but there might have been another guy out there who wasn't as big a name, who wasn't maybe as accomplished as some of the guys that you beat, that for some reason was your boogeyman, that had a style you couldn't deal with. Obviously, in the 1970s for Muhammad Ali, that was Ken Norton. He just couldn't handle Ken Norton's style. In fact, Muhammad Ali might have had a couple of boogeymen, right? Joe Frazier's style always gave him fits. And even Jimmy Young gave him all he could handle. These, other than Joe Frazier, were not the big names in the 1970s. Ken Norton was there or thereabouts, but he wasn't one of the top guys. He wasn't one of the elite guys, right? And certainly Jimmy Young wasn't perceived to be one of the elite guys. Leon Spinks, I mean, he was an Olympic gold medalist, but nobody thought he would beat Muhammad Ali, even towards the back end of Ali's career. Obviously, Ali came back and avenged that loss. But the point I'm making here is, I mean, you could talk about Lennox Lewis as well. Lennox Lewis lost to Oliver McCall and Hasim Rahman, but they probably wouldn't even make the top 5 opponents that Lennox Lewis faced in terms of being formidable, right? Lennox Lewis fought Evander Holyfield, who was better than the pair of them. He fought, Razor Ruddock. He fought David Tua, although David Tua, to be fair, should have lost to Hasim Rahman. He beat Vitaly Klitschko, people like Tony Tucker, etc., 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 right? Frank Bruno. So Lennox Lewis fought and beat better people. Ray Mercer's another one. Better people than the guys he lost to. But he still lost to those guys because if you have enough fights at heavyweight at world level, chances are somebody's going to get you. And it's often the person you least expect. All right. So you have to give a fighter, in my opinion, brownie points for their longevity at the top. Longevity is what Alexander Usyk doesn't have at heavyweight. He doesn't have a deep resume of, let's say, at least 14, 15 heavyweight title fights against different opponents. Doesn't have that. He's had 6 world heavyweight title fights against only 3 opponents. That's not like Muhammad Ali, who had over 20 world title fights. That's not like Larry Holmes, who had, I think, something similar to that. That's not like Mike Tyson, who had 16, Lennox Lewis, who had 17, Holyfield, who was in the similar ballpark. Even the Klitschko's, right? They were around in a weak era, but still, loads and loads of world heavyweight title fights. And during the period that they were fighting at world level, they both lost. That's what happens when you go on for that long and you step into that squared circle that many times with big men wearing tiny gloves. So, as much as I might be of the opinion that Usyk could beat Muhammad Ali or whatever in a fantasy matchup, I can't judge his greatness in the all-time list based upon my very subjective opinion about who I think he could beat. Do you know what I mean? I have to base it on the resume. And he does have big names on there. He beat the main guys at the time in Anthony Joshua, Tyson Fury, and Daniel Dubois. They were the main guys at the time when he fought him. But yeah, you'd need a lot deeper resume than that, in my opinion, to really make a serious case for him being top 5 of all time based on records. Do you know what I mean? Shout out to Adam for the super chat. He says, which of today's heavyweights would you give the best chance against the prime Tyson? I'd have to say Usyk because he's a southpaw and because he is fantastic technically. He's tough. He's got stamina. He hits harder than people give him credit for. He throws a load of punches. He's got great footwork. I wouldn't even necessarily pick him to beat a prime Tyson. I think it's a very, very interesting stylistic matchup. But I'd give him the best chance out of anybody for sure. I don't see anybody else really. Other than, and this might sound crazy to some people, right? But other than Usyk, I might actually give Jarrell Miller the best shot against Mike Tyson, a prime Tyson. Yes, Jarrell Miller, because a prime Mike Tyson would struggle to push Jarrell Miller back. If Jarrell Miller can push Mike Tyson back, he's halfway to victory. It doesn't mean he's all the way there. But if you can push Tyson back, you're halfway there. If Mike Tyson's coming forward, it becomes so difficult because he's explosive, he's fast, he throws shots from different angles, body, head, he's relentless, he's vicious. But on the back foot, Mike Tyson was nowhere near as effective. He could still get you on the back foot. Don't get it twisted. There were guys who pushed him back and still got chinned. I mean, look at the likes of Peter McNeely and Buster Mathis Jr., but they weren't very good fighters, right? But generally, when Mike Tyson started to get pushed back, it was the beginning of the end. In all his losses, that's when the end starts to happen is when he starts getting pushed back. So Jarrell Miller, because of his size, his chin, people sometimes exaggerate Mike Tyson's power. They get carried away with Mike Tyson's power. They act like nobody could take his punch and this, that. All he'd have to do is hit Jarrell Miller once on the chin and it'd be over. I mean, as I say, people get carried away. Mike Tyson was a great puncher, but he wasn't one of the, in my opinion, biggest one-punch knockout artists of all time. No. He had good one-punch power, but a lot of the time when he dropped people off a single shot, it was down to the precision of the shot. I don't think he had as much brute force as some other great punchers out there, right? And you see the likes of James Quick Tillis going the distance with him, a guy who'd been stopped a bunch of times in his career. You see the likes of Bone Crusher Smith going the distance with him. He got stopped several times in his career. Holyfield had been stopped by Riddick Bowe. Mike Tyson couldn't stop him in 2 attempts. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah, Mike Tyson was a very good puncher and vicious and fast and all that, but I don't see a reason why Jarrell Miller would be overwhelmed by Mike Tyson's power. He might be overwhelmed by his speed. I think worst case scenario for Jarrell Miller, he'd go out like Brian Nielsen or something. He was a tough guy. Not as tough as Miller, I don't think, but he was tough. Not as big as Miller either in terms of body mass. But yeah, anyway, that's my answer. I would say Usyk would have the best chance against the prime Tyson of the guys around now, followed by Jarrell Miller. Because of his size and potential ability to push Mike Tyson back. Somebody said there, Mike Tyson didn't like being bullied. Well, yeah, you got to bully the bully. Mike Tyson was a classic example of that. Bully the bully, and you can get to him. All right, so here we go. Let's talk about some of these geriatric fights then. So, Eric Butterbean Esch. He was, I want to say, a gimmick fighter, a novelty attraction from the 1990s. Promoted by Bob Arum, at least when he first burst on the scene. They were writing about him a lot in the boxing publications back then. He was a big, portly man. I'm being polite here. Very, very portly man. And if you don't know his backstory, he was working in a warehouse, I believe, if memory serves me correct. He was working in a warehouse. And he was apparently very naturally strong because he could lift these like big heavy boxes and what have you. And so some of the guys at his workplace wondered how good he would be in a fight. So they encouraged him to enter a local tough man tournament. Now, in the American Midwest and in the American South, I don't know if these still take place. I'm assuming they do. Rednecks used to have what they call tough man tournaments, which are basically like unlicensed boxing matches, right? Tommy Morrison, for example, who's from Oklahoma, he participated when he was a very young kid, as I understand it, in a lot of tough man tournaments and whatnot. And you can still see things that are similar to this on YouTube now. So yeah, I think they still do it. They call it like backyard boxing. They put on boxing gloves, but sometimes there's no actual canvas. They're like fighting in mud or grass or whatever, but there's like ropes around for a makeshift ring. So something along those lines, if there was a ring, in some cases there might be one. So yeah, he was challenged by his work colleagues to participate in a local tough man tournament, Butterbean. And he agreed, but when he went to go apply or, go sign up to be in this tough man tournament, they said there was a weight limit of, I think it was 300 pounds or 320 pounds or 350, something like that. And at the time he was weighing like 400 pounds. So he went on a diet of butter beans. He ate nothing but butter beans for whatever it was, several months, a year. And he lost the weight necessary to qualify for the tough man tournament. And that's where the name Butterbean came from, because his actual name is Eric Esch. So yeah, that's where the Butterbean name came from. And I guess he won a couple of tough man tournaments. Also lost one maybe, because he fought a guy from Detroit who was a gangster called, this guy also does YouTube now, called Nate Boone, or Nate Craft, excuse me. Nate Craft, his nickname was Boone, his street name was Boone. So anyway, from his Tough Man tournament background, he then turned professional. And the quality of opposition that they were matching him with was very similar to the quality of opposition that he was fighting in Tough Man tournaments. You know, a lot of rednecks who were pulled out of bars and off ranches and farms and stuff like that, pulled out of the crowd. Yeah, they would line these guys up as fodder for Butterbean, and he was knocking them out in spectacular fashion. It has to be said, he was a very entertaining novelty fighter. Of course, he had the Stars and Stripes shorts on, and he had this very gregarious kind of American everyman personality, which a lot of Americans and a certain demographic gravitated towards. And yeah, he was going well, promoted by Aram again as a gimmick fighter, a novelty fighter. Everyone who knew anything about boxing knew that it wasn't going to last long. Do you know what I mean? In terms of, as soon as they step him up, he's not going to fare very well, right? Because when I say last long, he actually had a very long career. We'll come on to that in a second. He had many, many professional fights. But yeah, everyone knew as soon as they step this guy up, he's going to get exposed because he's just a gimmick fighter. He was the Johnny Fisher of his day. In fact, he was better than Johnny Fisher, okay? But like Johnny Fisher, he was a gimmick fighter. Like Alan Babich, like, would it be cruel to call Dave Allen? At least back in the days, Dave Allen was a bit of a gimmick fighter. Now maybe he's progressed above that. Could we argue that? I don't know. But yeah, Butterbean was a gimmick fighter. But he was a tough guy, and he gave it a go. And he would always come out swinging. In fact, he used to challenge Mike Tyson back in the 90s. This was after Tyson came out of prison. And Butterbean was convinced, well, he claimed he was convinced that he would beat Mike Tyson in a 4-round fight. Yeah, he said he was the king of 4-rounders. And he was begging Mike Tyson for years to fight him in a 4-rounder. Obviously, it never happened. I think Mike Tyson said he wouldn't fight Butterbean because it was just, you know, again, Butterbean would be fodder for him. And he liked Butterbean's personality and everything. So anyway, that's Butterbean if you're not familiar with him. He went on to become like a cult or garner a cult following outside of boxing. He was in Jackass with Johnny Knoxville, and he knocked out Johnny Knoxville in Jackass, all that stuff from back in the days. So that's him. And by the way, he's a lot slimmer now than he was during his fighting days. I'm not sure what he weighs, but yeah, he's nowhere near as heavy as he was when he was fighting, which is pretty remarkable, right? So this is his BoxRec page. You can see there he's from, born in Atlanta, Georgia, so he's from the South. His residence is Jasper, Alabama. 5'11 and a half, 78-inch reach, which is quite a long reach for somebody so short for a heavyweight. And then look at the record. 77, 10 and 4. 91 pro bouts in total. That's an enormous amount of experience. Even if it's mostly against poor opposition, still that's a lot of fights compared to the guy he's calling out, John Fury, right? And some of the names he did fight were the likes of Larry Holmes. He also fought, well, his first loss, as far as I can remember, was at Madison Square Garden to a guy called Mitchell Rose. I remember where that happened. I think it's on YouTube. You can watch the Mitchell Rose fight on YouTube. And Mitchell Rose is like a journeyman. I'm not sure if he was from New York. He might have been from New York. But anyway, he stopped Butterbean in like 2 rounds. So that was when the hype train was over. But he continued on after that. He fought Peter McNeely as well. That was one of the more notable names. McNeely being notable because he got knocked out in the round by Mike Tyson in Mike Tyson's first fight back after his prison sentence for the Desiree Washington thing. But yeah, so that's Eric Esch, Butterbean in a nutshell. An all-action behemoth fire plug of a heavyweight. As I say, 5'11 and a half, 350 pounds for a lot of his professional career. Never mind the Tough Man tournament stuff. The pro career, he was like 350. And he even participated, I think, at one point in MMA. I'm sure he was in MMA. That man's done literally everything these days, since that time. Now, going up against Gypsy John Fury, prime for prime, I would have picked Butterbean to beat Gypsy John Fury, a.k.a. John Partridge. I would have picked Butterbean because of the experience, because I think he had a better chin, and also because Butterbean could hit a lot harder than John Fury. Again, look at the records. Butterbean, 77 fights, 77 wins, 57 KOs. 57 KO. Okay, yeah, he's mostly beating pies, but still, that's 57 men he's knocked out. John Fury, go back to John Fury's record, 8 wins, 1 KO. Do you know what I mean? And he fought at a low level. Other than Henry Akinwande, he was fighting at a low level. He was fighting at area level, British level at best. Yeah? I think Henry Akinwande actually fought a British heavyweight title and got sparked out in, 2 rounds? All these other fights were, was Michael Murray British level when John Fury fought him? Maybe not, because Michael Murray was kind of a circuit journeyman in the UK, but at one point he got fairly useful. And that's probably John Fury's best win, was over Michael Murray. From Manchester, Michael Murray. So, I would pick Butterbean prime for prime. I'm not sure about now because I haven't seen what Butterbean's doing. I would guess maybe I'd still pick Butterbean now because he's been more active than John Fury over the past, let's say, 20 years. I'm sure Butterbean fought as recently as 2013. John Fury hasn't fought since the 90s. So I'll probably go with Butterbean, but all of this is kind of irrelevant because you wouldn't imagine that John Fury would accept such a challenge anyway, right? John Fury claimed to be the best man in his 50s in the world and, coming out with all this big talk. But when push came to shove, when the likes of Mickey Theo, Dominic Negus, who else called him out now? Joe Egan, and various other men in his age range called him out. He was nowhere to be seen. Man kept pricing himself out. So, the fight's almost certainly not going to happen because you know how John Partridge likes to carry on. Shout out to Brad for the super chat. He says, Father Time is undefeated, but for the moment, Usyk has him on the ropes. If he stays, do you think he could be a next Bernard Hopkins? Well, potentially, but you have to remember that Bernard Hopkins lost fights, right? If Usyk continues on for several more years, I expect him to lose fights. Could he potentially then come back and win fights and regain titles? Maybe. But Bernard Hopkins did not have, this is one thing you have to bear in mind, right? Bernard Hopkins did not have hundreds and hundreds of amateur fights. Bernard Hopkins learned how to box in prison. He went to prison for, what was it, armed robbery or something? And back in those days, I think they might still have it in some US states. They had a boxing program in prison. And so that's where Bernard Hopkins learned to fight, in prison, or learned to box. And he might have had, 30 fights or something in prison, and then came out and started his professional boxing career. So although he had a very long pro career, he had a very short amateur career. And it all counts in terms of wear and tear on the body. Also, Bernard Hopkins had a much more conservative boxing style. He didn't move as much in terms of upper body movement and foot movement and head movement as Alexander Usyk does. That type of style, although he has the technique, right, he's immaculate technically, he's also to some extent relying on his movement. And movement as you get older is bound to slow. You're bound to get less fluid, less coordinated. Your reflexes are going to dull and all that kind of thing. So, yeah, Bernard Hopkins had the longevity he had by just making himself extremely awkward. He scored barely any knockouts towards the back end of his career, Hopkins. And he was an extremely dirty fighter. Yeah, Hopkins was so dirty. And that's why I actually lost patience with Hopkins. As much as it was impressive to see a man that old beating youngsters, there was so much skullduggery in his game. He reminded me of a character from a movie called Gladiator. This is not the Gladiator with Russell Crowe. This is a movie, Gladiator, starring, in fact, let me look up the cast. Can somebody in the comments remind me of the name of the actors that read Gladiator? I know the faces, but I can't think of the names. So let me look it up real quick. All right, Gladiator was a movie. From, I want to say, the 1990s. Who was it starring? See, it's not that one. It's not the 2000 with Russell Crowe about ancient Rome. No, it was, maybe somebody can help me out here in the chat. Cuba Gooding Jr., thank you, Mark. Yes, Cuba Gooding Jr., yes, he was in it. That's right, I forgot he was in it, but he definitely was in it, now that you remind me. Yes, Cuba Gooding Jr. was in Gladiator. And there's an old man in that movie, Gladiator, and he is fighting somebody. Is he fighting Cuba Gooding Jr. in a bare knuckle? And every time the guy goes to punch him in the face, who's much younger than him, he just puts his forehead down and allows their fist to hit his forehead. And he keeps saying, you know, the forehead, the hardest part of the body, and the person busts their hands up and stuff like that. So that's what Hopkins reminds me of. He was like a dirty fighting old pro who knew all the dirty tricks. He'd literally do everything. He'd hit you low. He'd headbutt you. He headbutted so many fighters deliberately. He would gouge you in the eye with he'd thumb you in the eye. He'd lace you. They used to call it lacing, where they take the laces of the gloves and they rub the laces in your face. Hopkins did everything, bro. He was such a dirty fighter. Is Usyk really going to go down that road? I wouldn't have thought so. Right? Usyk is not that kind of dirty fighter. So, I think it will be difficult for him to go on anywhere near as long as Hopkins, right? Because Hopkins was willing to go to extremes in order to have longevity in his career. So yeah, that's my take on Alexander Usyk. Hopefully he doesn't try to go on that long, because I think it will take away. I don't think Usyk has the time. Maybe I'm wrong, you know. It's for him, if he wants to prove the likes of me wrong. But I don't think he has the time on his side to be able to, let's say, get 5 to 10 more fights in, winning them all, and then sailing off into the sunset actually as a universally recognized top 5 heavyweight of all time in terms of resume. At 38 years of age, I don't know, man. It sounds like a tough ask to me. It sounds like a push. Because sometimes I feel like I'm experiencing deja vu. Whenever I hear, particularly a heavyweight champion, who the public are all saying is invincible, basically, there's nobody around that can beat him. The amount of times I've heard the majority of boxing fans say that about somebody, 1 or 2 fights later, the guy gets beat. I've literally lost count of the amount of times people have said that. So to give you examples, when Mike Tyson was gearing up to fight Buster Douglas in February of 1990 in Tokyo, nobody on earth outside of Douglas's team thought that not only Douglas would win, but that it would even be remotely competitive. It was just a given that Mike Tyson was going to go in there and blast Buster Douglas out in a round or 2. It was a totally routine. It was actually seen as a bit of a cherry pick, soft touch defense. Mike Tyson against Buster Douglas. So, you know, Mike Tyson was seen as totally invincible. Everybody was saying there's no one out there that can touch him. There's just no one out there. Maybe Holyfield could try for a couple rounds, but he ain't going to beat him. There's no one out there that can do it. But it happened. He got done by Buster Douglas, right? Lennox Lewis never really reached that level of perceived invincibility. But by the time he'd beaten Holyfield, and then he had a couple of defenses of the unified titles against Michael Grant and Francois Botha. And he'd also beaten David Tua, right? After those, there were people saying, okay, that's it. There's nobody out there that can beat him. And as soon as they started saying there's nobody out there that can beat him, you know, he's come back from adversity. The Oliver McCall thing was a very, very long time ago when he lost to McCall. That's when the Hasim Ratman fight happened, the first Hasim Ratman fight, and he got chinned. But nobody can beat him. There's nobody out there that can do it. It's always the guy you least expect. Because Lewis had fought and beat better people than Hasim Ratman. Do you know what I mean? He's always the guy you least expect. So I've been here so many times. I mean, even when Klitschko lost to Fury, the vast majority of people, myself included, did not think Fury was going to win that fight. I thought Fury had a chance, but I thought it would be very difficult for him away from home in Germany to get a decision. He'd really need to totally dominate. And I didn't see that happening. And most people didn't see that happening. You know, there was obviously the Fury diehards and some other very shrewd people. The Fury diehards are definitely not shrewd, but I'm talking about people who were not Fury fanboys, but just saw something which I didn't see. They were picking Fury, but the vast majority of people, no, they were picking Klitschko to win. After Klitschko knocked out Pulev, in particular, people were saying there's nobody out there that can beat him. One thing I did predict is I said that Klitschko will not be able to go through all of these young heavyweights coming up, the likes of Fury, Wilder, Joseph Parker, etc., without taking a loss. And I said, I'm not sure which one of them is going to beat him, but one of them is going to beat. If he fights them all, one of them is going to get him. And that's ultimately what happened. Not because I'm some kind of Nostradamus, obviously not, right? Or else I would have picked Fury to beat him. But I just knew that my experience watching heavyweight boxing since the 80s, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it rhymes sometimes. And whenever people start saying that a heavyweight champion is invincible, there's no one out there to beat him, that's when I start getting anxious. That's when I start thinking, nah, man, something's going to happen here. So I think if Usyk were to go on 5 to 10 more fights, somebody will beat him. That's my personal opinion. Could I be wrong? Of course. But we shall see the way things unfold. Shout out to Richard Serban for the super chat. He says, John Partridge might just accept the fight though. Butterbean had major health issues recently. Look him up with Diamond Dallas page, DDP Yoga. Okay. Thank you for the information. All right. In that case, maybe the fight will happen. Thank you for the heads up on that. If Butterbean is really on his last legs in terms of health, maybe that'll be enough to give John Partridge some confidence. But then again, Mickey Theo, I think, had some serious health issues not too long ago, and John Partridge still weren't willing to fight him. So we'll see. But we all know what John Partridge is about anyway. That's the point I'm making. Samil says, invincibility at heavyweight is silly. These are giants who could knock anyone out. Indeed. The heavyweight division is unlike any other division because the power to punch resistance relation, is that the best way to describe it, is so out of whack at heavyweight compared to welterweight, middleweight, so on and so forth, right? The best way I could describe it is to say that welterweights are able to take each other's punches better than heavyweights are. So their punch resistance is more proportionate to their punching power. Whereas in the heavyweight division, the punching power is way disproportionately higher than the punch resistance. Do you know what I mean? And also the stamina is not as good. The technique is not as good. So heavyweights tend to get hit cleaner when they do get hit. And there's massive size disparities in terms of height, reach, and weight. So yeah, in the heavyweight division, anyone can get it, man. Seriously, it's like the can man, for real, for real. Anyone can get it on any given day. As no matter how good you are or how seemingly invincible you look, you know, it can happen to anyone. Shout out to G-Man in the chat. He says, John Partridge is good, But Luke Partridge just sounds way funnier. That's a whole fact. Luke Partridge does sound way funnier. Mr. Grandy says, out of all the current top heavyweights, I don't see anyone beating Usyk. He beat men out weighing him 50 pounds. He beat punchers. He beat gold medalists. Who's left? You say all that, but he's beat 3 guys in heavyweight title fights. 3 guys. That is not enough guys to convince me that nobody out there can beat him. He's beaten 3 guys, bro. Do you know what I mean? He's rematched them all. That's why he's got 6 world heavyweight title fights, and it's been stretched out over several years to make it seem as though, not that this was the intention, but because it's been stretched out over several years, it gives the public the impression that he's been running through the heavyweight division and cleaning out the division. He's beaten the top guys. You always give him credit for that. But because of these unfortunate rematches, he hasn't been able to really round out his resume the way you would have hoped. Anyway, let's move on from John Partridge and Butterbean. Let's talk about another geriatric heavyweight, Ike Ibeabuchi, who's very active on his YouTube channel, by the way. If you haven't seen it, it's quite bizarre. He put this post up a few hours ago. Finally, Road to Return is here. It's with great heart, privilege, and honor that yours truly will be in a 12-round heavyweight showdown with Danny Williams of the United Kingdom on August 23, 2025 in Lagos, Nigeria. Tickets are available at prizefighting.tv, and the fight will be streamed live. So please do me a favor and show your appreciation, anticipated appreciation, to this great occasion. In fact, I didn't take a screenshot of the whole post. Let me get the whole post screenshot up. Where's Ibeabuchi's channel? I thought I'd taken a screenshot of the entire post. Hold tight, peeps. Let's go over to his channel, read out the whole thing. Where's my man Ike? Where's he at? Where's this channel at? Okay, some of his channel's not appearing in the search. Let's check over here. I'm sure I'm subscribed to him on my main channel. Am I? Am I subscribed to this crazy Nigerian? It's like 60 or so. No, not 60, 50 something. 50 something years old now. Oh man. Why can't I find Ike Ibeabuchi's channel here? Ike Ibeabuchi channel. Come on, man. Where is it? There he is. Okay. Found it. So, sorry about that, folks. The entire post. Yeah, there's not much more. It just says, please do me a favor and show your anticipated appreciation to this great occasion, which has lasted for more than 26 years. Enjoy, thanks, and God bless. All right, so that's the president, as he used to call himself, Ike Ibeabuchi. Coming back fighting Danny Williams, who actually is around the same age as Ibeabuchi. I think the exact same age. So here you go. Ike Ibeabuchi, born on February 2nd, 1973 in Nigeria. Again, nicknamed the President, 6'2", 76-inch reach. Has a professional, orthodox of course, has a professional boxing record of 20-0, 15 KOs. Gone up against the very well-known in the UK, Danny Williams, who famously beat a washed-up Mike Tyson, the exact same age at 52, from Brixton, London. the Brixton Bomber, Dynamite Dan, 6'1.5", 79-inch reach, has a current record of 89 fights, 55 wins, 42 wins by knockout, 33 losses, and 1 no contest. Right? So Danny Williams, who did have his British Boxing Board of Control license taken off him many years ago on health grounds, continued to box as a journeyman in Eastern Europe and other parts of the world. Okay? It's a sad story, really, what's happened to Danny Williams, because he's so punch drunk, and yeah, his brain must look like Swiss cheese at this stage. At this point, it's crazy. So he's apparently fighting Ike Ibeabuchi. I say apparently because Ibeabuchi was scheduled to fight at the back end of last year, but a fight never happened for some reason. That was also supposed to be in Nigeria. The plug got pulled on that fight. It actually appeared on BoxRec, I think, at one stage, but yeah, the plug was pulled on the fight. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because of the age. I wouldn't have thought that would be an issue fighting in some Nigerian state. You know what I mean? Surely one of the states in Nigeria would have let him fight there, but somehow, as I say, it got pulled. Maybe it was a money thing, I'm not sure. So let's see if this one goes ahead with Danny Williams. It's not yet on BoxRec. This is Ibeabuchi's BoxRec page. That looks like a relatively old picture of him there. Certainly not the most recent of his pictures. What do you guys think of this? Ike Ibeabuchi, who some people class as one of the biggest underachievers in certainly heavyweight boxing history. One of the biggest what-ifs, unfulfilled potential in the heavyweight division in many, many decades. What do you think of him fighting the likes of Danny Williams? Ibeabuchi, at his age and spending all that time in the penitentiary, he doesn't have anything close to the ability and the athleticism that he used to have in his heyday. Watching him hit the bag these days is quite painful. You know what I mean? It's quite painful to watch because, as I say, he just does not have anything close to what he used to have in the ring. My live tab has crashed there. What's going on? Can we revive this, please, YouTube? Tab's always got to crash at least a couple times in the stream. Hopefully you guys can still hear me. Christian says, too old, not interested. Exactamundo says, heard reports Dubois sacked Don. Have I heard out? Nope, heard nothing so far. Godo says, Danny Williams following in James Toney's path. Well, to be fair, James Toney never really ended up as bad as Danny Williams. You never saw James Toney getting knocked out and all that type of stuff. Whereas with Danny Williams, he'd been knocked out so many times. You know what I mean? Like just shocking knockout losses to obscure opponents in the backwaters of Eastern Europe. With James Toney, it never got that bad. I think one of the low points for James Toney might have been losing to Lucas Brown. But again, he didn't get knocked out. He lost on points. Shout out to Lawrence King for the super chat. He says, what is your prediction for White versus Atama? I've got Moses Atama knocking Dylan White out inside 7 rounds. Godo says, not record-wise, but Toney took so much punishment. Yeah, he did. James Toney is punch drunk to high heaven. James Toney is kind of like Riddick Bowe. He can barely string a sentence together. He's so punch drunk. All right, nobody interested in Ike Ibeabuchi versus Danny Williams. Can't blame him. It is a bizarre fight between two washed-up old men. One thing I can tell you about Ike Ibeabuchi from watching his YouTube channel is that he appears to still be crazy. He was very crazy back in the days. That's what landed him in the penitentiary for 20 years or something, right? But if you watch his YouTube videos now, he's still not the full biscuit, and you wouldn't expect him to be. You wouldn't expect a person who went into the pen crazy and did 20 years hard time to come out and be mentally normal. Should I mean that he's definitely not mentally normal still. So, yeah, that's Ike Ibeabuchi. And then finally, on this pensioner beef, we've got Roy Jones ripping into Floyd Mayweather about Mayweather's career. Who did Floyd beat in his prime? Nobody. Now, I have to side with Roy Jones in this beef because Roy Jones did things which Floyd Mayweather never dared to do in his career. So here we have a guy in Roy Jones who fought as low as 154 and fought as high as heavyweight. He beat John Ruiz for the WBA heavyweight title. So from 54 to over 200 pounds, that is crazy. And there was no like catch weight and rehydration clause or anything like that when he fought John Ruiz. He fought guys who were taller than him, who had longer arms than him. I mean, the size difference between Roy Jones and most of his light or many of his light heavyweight opponents was far greater, not just in terms of natural weight, but even height and reach. And height and reach, I keep emphasizing this point because Mayweather had unusually long arms for his height. Okay. I remember HBO used to use arm length rather than reach as part of their tail of the tape, which is a far more accurate and relevant measurement as far as I'm concerned. Or accurate. I could describe it as accurate, but a far more relevant measurement is reach rather than arm length. Arm length rather than reach. And HBO went through a period of using arm length instead of reach. And they actually showed that Mayweather had the same arm length as one of the Klitschko's. I can't remember if it was Vitaly or Vladimir, but he had the same arm length as one of the Klitschko's, just to show you how long the guy's arms were. And he used those very long arms to his advantage because he fought very few people that had longer arms than him. And that, combined with his precision, his coordination, and his athleticism, is what allowed him to control things at long range. Yeah? Somebody tried to tell me that Diego Corrales had longer arms than Floyd Mayweather. No, he didn't. He didn't at all. Diego Corrales was like a T-Rex. He was like a tall guy with short arms. Didn't have longer arms than Mayweather at all. Neither did De La Hoya. De La Hoya, I think, might have had a longer reach, but reach and arm length are two different measurements. Mayweather still had longer arms. Roy Jones fought people who had much longer arms than himself. Much taller, rangier, everything. You know, he took challenges that Mayweather would never take. He did beat people in their prime, all-time great fighters in their prime, which Mayweather never did. He beat Bernard Hopkins in his prime. He beat James Toney in his prime. Again, jumped up and fought John Ruiz, massively bigger than him, in Ruiz's prime. Not that Ruiz was a great fighter, but still he's fighting a heavyweight, you know? Mayweather never did anything like that. He had opportunities to do things like that, but he never took those opportunities. He always wanted things massively weighted in his favor before he'd take any kind of risk, at least during his welterweight career. In the lower weight classes, 140, lightweight, super featherweight, he was a bit more of a risk taker because the physicality was there. He actually was bigger than a lot of the guys he fought in those weight classes. But once he stepped up to welterweight, where he was fighting guys who weren't necessarily taller than him, but they were naturally heavier than him, that's when he started becoming far more careful about who he fought and when he fought him, and certainly when he was fighting at 54. So look, Mayweather, great fighter, no question about that. Great technique, great defensive ability, and so on. But he was not a Roy Jones. For one, he wasn't pound for pound that kind of freakish athlete. I mean, Mayweather was a great athlete, but he wasn't a freakish athlete that like Roy Jones was. And as I say, he just didn't do as much as Roy Jones did, objectively speaking, you know? So Roy Jones, I completely have to back him in this conversation, whatever you want to call it, argument, beef that he's having with Floyd Mayweather. It's very easy for Mayweather to do the cheap little things that we know that he's known for doing, like, playing Roy Jones highlights, he says sarcastically, which are just videos of Roy Jones getting knocked out when he was way past his best. And getting knocked out when he was way past his best by people who are far bigger than him naturally, by the way. Without catch weights, without rehydration clauses, which Mayweather always insisted on when he was fighting somebody bigger than him, if he could get away with it, obviously against De La Hoya. And De La Hoya wasn't really bigger than him anyway. I mean, maybe slightly, but, De La Hoya turned pro at, I think, super featherweight as well, just like Mayweather did. So, yeah, you got to back Roy, man. If Roy had retired after that Ruiz fight, I don't think there'd be anyone backing Mayweather in this discussion whatsoever. But he is an example of somebody who went on for far too long and tarnished his resume, tarnished his legacy to such an extent that people forget who Roy Jones was in his prime. It's as if after my generation, boxing fans remember him more for being a knockout victim than being a boxing phenom, which is what he was. So, if Mayweather had continued fighting legit opposition for as long as Roy Jones Jr. did, right? Or fighting live opponents for as long as Roy Jones Jr. did, Mayweather would have started racking up losses. But he has preserved the image of himself as the invincible fighter by protecting that O. Whereas Roy Jones, he weren't trying to protect the O. He was trying to fight everybody. So that's what you get. Shout out to Lawrence King for the super chat. He says, in fact, before I get to him, there's a couple of others here. Shout out to Costanza versus Kramer for the super chat. He says, Dwight Muhammad Qawi died. Yep, he did. Dwight Muhammad Qawi, former cruiserweight champion, had a couple of fights with Evander Holyfield. The first fight in particular was an absolute war, a classic at cruiserweight. Dwight Muhammad Qawi was only about 5'5", 5'6", very short man. But of course, it was a former light heavyweight as well. But fighting at cruiserweight at a time when the cruiserweight limit was 190 pounds. All right, just to put that in perspective. He was kind of reminiscent stylistically of Joe Frazier. Looked slightly like him as well. He also competed at heavyweight, fought George Foreman at heavyweight, gave it a good go, but ultimately got stopped. And that was probably the best shape that George Foreman was ever in during his comeback in the late 1980s. So yeah, Dwight Muhammad Qawi, former cruiserweight champion of the world, passed away. Shout out to Costanza versus Kramer for the super chat. Shout out to Lawrence King. He says, how highly do you rate Riddick Bowe? And do you feel, had he taken it more seriously and stayed in shape, he could have been an all-time great heavyweight? The problem with Riddick Bowe is that he was undisputed heavyweight champion. Yes, he did beat Evander Holyfield. Great win. Twice he beat Holyfield in the first and the third fights. But that was one particular style. Other than Holyfield, Riddick Bowe beat nobody. Literally nobody. So, to reel off some of the highlights of Riddick Bowe's career in terms of wins. Larry Donald, other than Holyfield, obviously. Larry Donald, a totally washed up Michael Dokes, a washed up Jesse Ferguson, who was only ever a fringe contender anyway. God, who else did Riddick Bowe? Jorge Luis Gonzalez. You're running dry already. You got a very controversial decision over ancient Tony Tubbs before he became champion. Washed up Tyrell Biggs, totally washed up. This is after Biggs had already been beaten by Mike Tyson years before that and was basically just a journeyman at that stage when Riddick Bowe beat him. God, who did Riddick Bowe? Herbie Hyde. I mean, Riddick Bowe's resume, other than Holyfield, was really, really weak. He does have a couple of wins technically over Andrew Golota, but they were both disqualification wins in fights where he was getting battered. Right? So, yeah, Riddick Bowe just had the Holyfield wins, and then everything else is not very impressive, okay, in terms of quality of opposition. So, is it a case that Bowe was that good and that's why he beat Holyfield, or was it a case that he just had Holyfield's number stylistically? It's hard to know. What I can tell you is obviously Riddick Bowe was a good amateur. He lost to Lennox Lewis in the Olympic final of the Seoul 88 games. He was a very fluid fighter. Big guy, 6'5". Reach must have been about 80, 81 inches, something like that. He was a good combination puncher. He had good punch variety. He had a very good jab. But he was always more comfortable fighting on the inside than at long range. He would jab well at long range, but he just had a tendency to want to mix it up. He didn't seem comfortable. See, Lennox Lewis was a guy who used his range very well. Exactly the same dimensions as Riddick Bowe, maybe a slightly longer reach. But if Lewis wanted to freeze you on the outside and keep you there and not allow you to get close to him, he could do that. Riddick Bowe never did that. I don't recall any fight in Riddick Bowe's whole career where he ever kept a shorter guy on the end of his jab on the outside so the guy couldn't get close to him. I don't recall him ever doing that. Maybe he couldn't do it. Maybe he didn't have the subtleties in his game, the defensive capabilities. I don't know. Okay. But because he never did that, it lent itself to entertaining fights. Riddick Bowe was nearly always in an entertaining fight. The only fight off the top of my head that I can think of Riddick Bowe's that wasn't entertaining was maybe the Larry Donald fight. The press conference is more entertaining than the fight itself. The press conference where he chinned Larry Donald. That was a dirty, dirty move from Riddick Bowe. He literally loaded up and hit Larry Donald with a two-piece, bare knuckle, bang on the chin. And Larry Donald, with a rock jaw, just stood there and looked at him. I don't think Larry Donald even put his... No, I think he might have put his fists up after that, but didn't even wobble. It was barely blinked. It was incredible, and there were two great shots. But yeah, Riddick Bowe, a little bit of an enigma, I want to say. I'm not sure how good he was. I'm going to say he wouldn't have been an all-time great, though. That's my guesstimation. He wouldn't have been an all-time great if he'd gone through better opposition or fought better opposition than he did other than Holyfield. Because there were vulnerabilities there defensively, definitely. That's why he's so punch-drunk now. And there may have been punch resistance vulnerabilities as well. I'm not sure his chin was that great. I'm not saying he had a glass jaw, but I don't think his chin was that great. He was hurt against Tyrell Biggs. He was dropped and nearly knocked out by Evander Holyfield in the third fight. He was hurt and dropped on numerous occasions by Andrew Galotta. So I don't think he held a shot as well as certainly the American media at the time would have had you believe. But shout out to Lawrence King. Shout out to Lawrence King again. He says, still remember Roy Jones ring walking with Method Man and Redman for the Ruiz fight was crazy. Also, Tony at heavyweight was hilarious too. 5'9" and fat, just shoulder rolling and trading with Ruiz and Peter. Yeah. And that really spoke to the audacity, the bravery, and the defensive, the confidence, and to some extent the defensive skills of James Toney. You know, even though he got hit a lot, he was still able to roll with the shots and take a certain amount of the sting off him, particularly at heavyweight. And yeah, he was like this roly-poly Pillsbury doughboy of a fighter by that point, with a big Buddha belly, shoulder rolling, who these heavyweights couldn't knock out. You know, Sam Peter was a massive puncher. Hasim Bratman was a good puncher. John Ruiz obviously was a mauler. And nobody could get James Toney out of there. Sam Peter, I think, dropped him. Was it in the first fight or second fight? I want to say it was in the second fight where Sam Peter dropped him. But yeah, it was funny. And certainly the ring walk for Roy Jones, Method Man and Redman, yep, for that John Ruiz fight, very memorable. Shout out to Rep for the super chat. He says, was Valuev the most successful gimmick fighter? I'd have to think about that. Was Valuev the most successful gimmick fighter? He might have been. It's definitely a very good shout. If he's not, it's a very, very good shout because he did actually hold a version of the heavyweight title. There have been many, many gimmick fighters over the years. The vast majority of them never actually get to hold a world title, a legitimate world title, whereas Valuev did. So, but to be fair, as gimmick fighters go, he was better than most. Yeah. Valuev far better than somebody like Johnny Fisher. Valuev better than Dave Allen. You know? Valuev better than Butterbean, in my opinion. So, yeah, as gimmick fighters go, he was like... Was he even a gimmick fighter then? Maybe it's harsh to call him a gimmick fighter. It was a little gimmicky, the way they marketed him, but he was of a higher level. than the guys I've just mentioned, or several levels higher than the guys I just mentioned. I mean, he should have lost to an Ancient Evander Holyfield. That was a robbery. But it's not like in his prime when he fought world level opponents, he was getting blasted out. You know, David Haye was taking a distance. You know? Mr. Grundy says, was Prince Nassim a gimmick fighter? Hell no. Prince Nassim definitely wasn't a gimmick fighter. For me, a gimmick fighter is a fighter who has very little ability, but they have some type of gimmick behind them, which allows them to get a following far bigger than their ability maybe deserves. That's how I would describe a gimmick fighter. Prince Nassim definitely wasn't a gimmick fighter. Prince Nassim was a very talented fighter and one of the greatest punchers I've ever seen at featherweight and even super bantamweight, where I think he turned pro super bantamweight rather than bantamweight. Correct me if I'm wrong. Sammy Khan says, have you seen Tunde Ajayi and Derek Chisora going at it? I haven't, but somebody else mentioned it in the live stream earlier on. What did Derek Chisora say to Tunde Ajayi, and what was the beef over? Was it the Daniel Dubois fight against Usyk and the argument about whether he quit or not? Is that what it was? Shout out to Jake. He says, Hatman, do you blame Mayweather for the toxic state of American boxing today? Has there ever been a Mayweather fight you've actually gone back and watched over and over again? I can't think of one. The answer is no. Mayweather fights were so dull to me, objectively, that I can't go back and watch a Mayweather fight more than once, unless there's a specific, let's say, argument or something I want to clear up. So I'll go back and watch it to point certain things out. But for entertainment, I've never gone back and watched the Mayweather fight again. And what else do you say there? Is Mayweather responsible for the toxic state of American boxing today? I would say largely he is, yes. Largely he is. Mr. Grundy says, was Deontay Wilder a gimmick fighter by your definition? No. No. Deontay Wilder was a legit world champion. He was a legit world champion. I would say if you actually win a legit world title and you defend it a bunch of times, personally, I wouldn't class that as a gimmick fighter. Because you must have something about you if you're winning world titles and you're able to defend them. You might not be the strongest world champion in the world, but if you're able to get to that level and defend your title a bunch of times, like, you've got to have something about you. With that being said, some people might have classed Primo Carnera as a gimmick fighter. He was certainly a protected champion. A gimmick fighter because he was the Valuev of his day, basically, Primo Carnera. He was the Valuev before Valuev. But personally, I think it's, I don't know, maybe a bit of a stretch to call a world champion a gimmick fighter. Babbage was a gimmick fighter, certainly. Yeah, Babbage, Johnny Fisher, Butterbean. He's a gimmick fighter, to me anyway, by my definition. But shout out to Rep 2016 for that super chat. All right, so let's move on from these geriatric boxers and talk about something very serious in the world of boxing now, okay? Some of you guys may have heard of this. Let's get the visuals up on screen. I'm going to read from an article, which you won't see on screen. You know, you'll hear me talk, you'll hear me quoting from it. But Bob Arum did an interview reacting to this proposed bill which seeks to amend the Ali Act and therefore give promoters more power and for there to be less transparency in professional boxing in the United States. So boxers will know less about what's going on and where the money for the shows is going and how it's divided up and so on and so forth. And this, of course, is being pushed by Dana White because he wants to kind of power over fighters in boxing that he has in UFC. All right. And it seems he's doing this with the approval of Turki Al-Sheikh. I'm not sure whether it's the approval or, exactly what goes on there, whether Turki Al-Sheikh approves of it or not, but he doesn't seem to be opposing it at the moment. So I'm going to read from this article. This is on Boxing Scene. It's a lengthy article that they've done. It's actually an interview with a lawyer. Okay. So it's a lawyer called Eric McGracken. Eric McGracken. It says here, Eric McGracken is a Canadian combat sports lawyer and commentator who follows the business of combat sports closely and has been awaiting the developments around the Ali Act. There is a bill proposing changes to the Act, which recently became public and has been labeled the Ali Revival Act. I mean, that's really a perverse name for the thing, isn't it? Revival Act, as if you're making it better or you're reviving Muhammad Ali to make boxing great again or something, when actually you're seeking to fleece fighters or make it easier for promoters to fleece fighters, should I say. Let me choose my words carefully. Make it easier for promoters to fleece fighters. There's nothing good about that from a fighter's perspective. Anyway, the interview goes as follows. Boxing Scene asked him, Eric McGracken, we knew this was coming and now the bill is out there in the open. Could it change the face of boxing? Absolutely. And change the face of boxing in a way that it's going to strip the rights of boxers. So the Ali Act, introduced a good 25 years ago, was brought in because boxers were being exploited financially through promoter practices. And this bill basically says, hey, a new type of promoter could be created that doesn't have to comply with the Ali Act so long as they do certain things. So that's terrible for boxers, and boxers need to pay attention to this because their rights are under jeopardy right now. And this bill could set back the rights of boxers decades if it passes. Do you feel that they will pay attention to it? Or do you think that some people are chasing short-term money without looking at the longer-term picture? I hope boxers will pay attention, is the best thing I can say. I don't want to be negative. The one thing that's difficult is boxers, unlike a lot of other organized sports, don't have a union. There's not a centralized place where a body of boxers are together and they could respond in a collective way. But the Mixed Martial Arts Fighters Association, the MMAFA, even though MMA is not boxing, the MMAFA has been organized for well over a decade. And they've been pushing to reform the Ali Act to expand it to all prize fighters. It makes no sense that boxers have certain rights, but other prize fighters, be it kickboxers, Muay Thai, mixed martial artists, can be exploited in a way that boxers can't be exploited. And so they've been pushing for years and years for the Ali Act to be expanded. And they're also pushing for the Ali Act to be protected. So boxers' rights shouldn't be stripped away. And if I was a professional boxer, or if I was a high caliber amateur boxer thinking of turning professional and concerned that my rights were going to be stripped, I would go to the Mixed Martial Arts Fighters Association. I would organize with them collectively to make sure your voice is heard, because this law shouldn't be passed to simply look after a promoter's financial interest. If you're a congressman and you're going to vote on this, you want to make sure it's good for the industry. You want to make sure it's good for the health of the sport. And I can't think of any world in which boxers' voices shouldn't be heard. And I'd encourage boxers to reach out to the MMAFA to make sure that their concerns are heard. When you heard about the sort of internal support unions, what do you think about the ABC's stance on this? That is the Association of Boxing Commissions. He said, I'm concerned about the ABC's stance. And I'll tell you why. A few years ago, and this is something I'm proud of, me, Carla Duran, Rose, Gracie, we asked the ABC to create a fighters committee, an athletes committee. It made no sense to me that all these regulators get together and they make decisions about boxing and MMA, and they don't have a formal way to reach out to fighters. And they listened to us, and they created something called the Athletes Voice Committee. And they appointed several people from different sports, MMA, boxing, officials, regulators, a whole bunch of people were put on this Athletes Voice Committee to make sure that athletes had an avenue to be consulted when important legal developments were arising. The Athletes Voice Committee was not consulted by the ABC. The ABC, I think, they spoke on behalf of their board. This is just in the press releases or the articles I read, but they basically said that the ABC, their board, unanimously supports this legislation. Those articles came out before the legislation was even public. I've got the bill here that just came out this week. But before this bill was published by Congress, there were articles saying that the ABC's board unanimously supported it, which means the ABC's board saw this before the public saw it. And the Athletes Voice Committee never saw it. The Athletes Voice Committee asked the ABC to share this with them to keep them in the loop. The Athletes Voice Committee was told that they would be kept in the loop, and they weren't kept in the loop. Just like a congressperson, why would you vote yes for this or no for this if you haven't consulted with the athletes, which the Ali Act was designed to protect athletes? Or when the Ali Act was designed to protect athletes, he should have said. So why wouldn't you listen to athletes before changing the Ali Act? And if you're a regulator, you're there to protect athletes, right? Combat sports are regulated to protect athletes from exploitation and to have certain health and safety standards in place. Why wouldn't you talk to athletes? And if you're the ABC and you created an athletes committee and that athletes committee wants to know what's going on, why wouldn't you loop them in to the conversation? So I don't know why the ABC board unanimously is supporting this. And I've heard from some state athletic commissions. I've talked to a few commissioners, and they tell me they were not kept in the loop. So when the board says they unanimously support it, that doesn't mean that all of the state commissions support this. A lot of the state commissions, from what I can tell, had never seen this bill before the ABC board was saying they approve it. So I'm not sure what's going on over there, but I think there's a lot of scrutiny that's required moving forward. They then ask him, but people have said for the longest time that boxing is broken, it needs an overhaul. That we could do with one set of rankings and one champion for each weight class. Is that not a step closer to what boxing needs? He says, well, if that's the concern somebody has, we have too many championships. This is creating more championships. This doesn't fix that at all. This is adding another belt or endless other belts. So if you're cynical, you could look at this bill and say, this is designed to let the UFC get into boxing. But you can't write a law that says this only applies to the UFC. So anybody that complies with the law can do it. So at a bare minimum, if this law passes, you end up having UFC or TKO or Zuffa Boxing or whatever they're going to call themselves. You can have this new promotion, and they have the right under law to create their own belt, their own title, and they have the right to decide the rankings. And they have the right to decide who fights for that belt, and that's separation from all the ABC alphabet belts that exist right now. So if somebody's saying, hey, there's too much going on in boxing, too many belts, this is giving more belts. So I don't see how that addresses that concern. This adds to that concern. And by the way, beyond TKO boxing or Zuffa boxing, you can have 100 other promoters come in and create their own belts. So it just completely waters down that landscape. And then I say, okay, is it designed to let one entity basically monopolize boxing? And so there's really only going to be one belt because they monopolize boxing. Well, that's not healthy for the sport or for boxers. Or is it designed to have a whole lot of competition with a bunch of new competing promoters with their own belts that really waters down the title picture? So I'm not sure people that say they have, I'm not sure people that say they have a persuasive argument. Some of this interview is not worded correctly. The grammar's off. Anyway, they ask him, you are approaching it with a critical eye, but do you see anything that suggests this could work out? Do you see an end game where this can make positive changes? We've seen different things about different pay structures. 150 minimum, I guess 150,000 it should say, it just says $150. 150,000 minimum for rounds. They're saying more safety, I'm not sure what that means actually. More safety steps, things that could have been discussed in the past, but also, is that going to be really difficult for the smaller promoters to pay to cover? Yeah, two things. One, there's something positive in this bill, and that's what's being presented to the public. But that's the distraction, not the main story. The main story is that this punches at the heart of the early protections. That's what the bill really does. That's what it is. But on the fringes, there are some minimum things that are good. Minimum pay and minimum insurance requirements. And so obviously having minimum pay for boxers, so you get $150, all right, so it is $150 per round, instead of some promoters paying boxers $1 per fight, you can't do that nonsense. So sure, there's a minimum protection and there's minimum insurance that boxers are going to get under this. Nobody's saying that is bad. Not one critic of this bill is saying, please don't give boxers those protections. The criticism is, why are you creating a new, I'll call it super promoter, this new breed of promoter that doesn't have to comply with the Ali Act? That's where the criticism is. But on the second point, when you create these minimum requirements, what that's going to do, this is not criticizing minimum requirements. This is just the practical result of it. You're going to kill some club shows. You're going to have some club shows, low-level boxing shows, that won't be able to afford to comply with this. And so you're going to have a concentration of power. You're going to have fewer lower-level promoters. And what that will do in the long term, the concentration of power, I guess, is never good, because it leads towards the potential for monopolization of the sport. And so there's a concern there. This act and the changes, though, and this is another question from Boxing Scene, make no difference in world boxing. It's clearly a huge issue for boxing in North America, but it doesn't apply worldwide, right? His answer is, yeah, we'll see. We'll have to see if this passes. We'll have to see which fighters go along with this new promotional entity and what sort of endgame there is. But you're right, boxing is a global sport, and boxing has a rich history and tradition around different pockets of the world. And so the United States is not the be-all and end-all, but it's an extraordinarily important market. And having monopolization in that extraordinarily important market is a bad thing for the overall health of professional boxing. And again, we have to see if this bill actually passes, because I think there's a handful of concerns with it. I think there's going to be pushback on this bill. I think any congressperson that looks at it critically and listens to the concerns that boxers are raising will have some pause about whether voting to support it. But if it passes, I don't think it's going to do anything good for the long-term health of boxing in the United States. And if you harm the health of boxing in the United States, I don't know what that does on the global stage. But I just don't see any positives from this bill in the long run. That's my take. Do you think the people in power at government level are strong enough to push back? Because when you look at the people involved, they were close to Donald Trump's push for presidency. It seems like they're going to be very brave and have to make their voices very loud. Are people invested enough? Some of the grammar here is terrible, Boxing Scene. Sort it out, please. Some of the grammar in this article, terrible. Anyway, his answer is, boy, the US political scene, in fact, I won't go into all this stuff. We don't need to hear about all this. you guys get the gist of what was said. It's a very, very long interview, which goes on for probably double what I've just read. Yeah, you guys get the gist of it. Let me read out some super chats here. Shout out to George, the Last Patriot. He says, Eric, I'm happy for the weight loss and successful back surgery. DDP worked his magic once again. Stay your old self, homie. Unnecessary even if you win. All right, that's George, the Last Patriot. Bigging up Eric Butterbean Esh. Shout out to Lawrence King for the super chat. He says, personally, I think it's dumb trying to bring in a UFC model. UFC fighters are criminally underpaid. Boxers have been overpaid for decades. It won't work. I tend to agree with that. But one thing you have to bear in mind regarding the Ali Act specifically is that the Ali Act only applies in America, because I've heard a lot of boxing fans over the years express concerns about the Ali Act as if it applies outside of America. There is no Ali Act in the UK. So certain things in America are prohibited. For example, acting as a boxer's manager and promoter at the same time. You're not allowed to do that in America because of the Ali Act. In the UK, you can do that. They've been doing that for years. They still do it now. You can be the guy's promoter and manager, no problem. But boxers are not protected by the Ali Act in the UK and any other country in the world as far as I'm aware. Shout out to Matt for the super chat. He says, UFC fighters also take way more punishment per dollar at elite level than boxers. Also, people claim boxing is more dangerous, but I don't know about that. Well, boxing is more dangerous for the brain. And there are more life-threatening injuries in boxing, as far as I'm aware. But then again, there's a lot more boxing fights. So I don't know percentage-wise, is there a higher percentage of fatalities and serious injuries in boxing than there is in MMA? I'm not sure, but because of the volume of fights in boxing compared to MMA, which is much greater in boxing, you do get a lot more fatalities and serious injuries. But my perception, at least, is that brain injuries are more common in boxing. Yeah, because boxers just take more blows to the head. MMA fighters are taking leg kicks, they're getting choked, they're getting arm barred, and all this other stuff comes into play. They're not taking as many head blows throughout the course of a fight typically as a boxer would. And that's where the danger comes in for boxers. Shout out to Matt again for the super chat. He says, the safety of the UFC model hasn't been around long enough to collect effective data in comparing boxing fatalities to UFC fatalities. UFC is smaller too. Yeah, you make good points. But it would make sense to me that boxing would have more head injuries, because again, boxers do get hit with more head punches and just more head blows, because obviously in MMA they use kicks as well. Boxers are constantly getting punched in the face, like non-stop. You watch an MMA fight, yeah, some of them you'll see them hitting each other regularly back and forth, but that's in a minority of those fights. In the majority of MMA fights, there's a punch or two landed here and there, kicks, grapple it, do you know what I mean? It's like a mixture of things. It's not like constant head punches. Boxers are receiving constant head punches all the way through a fight. Most boxers. But of course, in boxing, you're not going to suffer the same kind of injuries that you suffer in MMA as far as like broken legs. Your leg literally snapped in half like Anderson Silva had and many other fighters. Grotesque injuries like that. You're not really going to get in boxing. People get in boxers do suffer dislocated shoulders and stuff from time to time, but those things are more common in MMA, obviously, because of the submission moves and whatnot that they do. Shout out to Matt for the super chat. He says, grappling makes me tired to watch. And the most popular MMA or UFC fighters specifically, as I understand it, have been strikers for that reason. It seems that even MMA fans, let's say MMA casual fans at least, are far more entertained by kicking and punching than they are by wrestling. Cal says the UFC haven't had any deaths. Can't speak for any other promotions. And maybe that's enough, because you think of the boxing promoters. Frank Warren's had deaths and serious injuries. Well, in fact, who was the guy from Liverpool that died on a Frank Warren? Was it a Frank Warren show? There was a guy who died in the 90s. A guy from a guy from Liverpool, Merseyside. Was that a Frank Warren show? I can't remember if that was a Frank Warren show or if it was a Barry Hearn show. But obviously Frank Warren's had serious injuries on his shows. Gerald McClellan was on a Frank Warren show when he fought Nigel Benn. And many others over the years. Eddie Hearn's had deaths. On one of his shows, there was a young American fighter that died on an Eddie Hearn show. You guys remember that? That was only about, 5 or 6 years ago or something? Patrick Day, that's the guy's name. That's right. Thank you guys for reminding me. Yeah, Patrick Day died on an Eddie Hearn show 5 or 6 years ago. All right, was it the Usyk Witherspoon card? Yeah, CTE, because some people are bringing up rugby, rugby players who slur their words and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, CTE, like in American football. There's been a big scandal and issue over years about CTE. Okay, Jared Thompson says it was fall 2019 when Patrick Day died. Have I grappled? No, never grappled. Not in any kind of formal setting, like in street fights and stuff like that. Yeah, I've grappled with people in street fights, but I've never had any formal training in wrestling or grappling or anything like that. Blue Collar Sports TV says, I feel like Chris Benoit was the landmark case in regards to CTE. So did they rule that his actions were the result of CTE? Because there was a time when they were saying that his actions may have been the result of roid rage. Or was it a combination of roid rage and CTE? I would say in a one-on-one scenario, when there's not going to be anybody else intervening, there's no chance of anyone jumping in and anything like that, grappling is probably better than punching in most cases. It's more useful in a street fight. But the problem with street fights is that you will very rarely get a fair one-on-one. It's usually a very chaotic situation. And so if you're going to start grappling with somebody, that gives one of their friends the opportunity to run up behind you and attack you. Whereas when you're using your fists and you're moving about, you can keep your wits about you. You're not stationary for too long in case you have to fight multiple people. NJ says, Hatman, in your prime, how fast could you run a 3 mile? No idea. Never timed myself in my prime doing distance runs. Truth be told, I did very little long distance running because I've always been a sprinter. My body always responded far better to sprint training. And so I never really focused on doing like long runs and all that type of stuff. I probably do more long runs now in my mid 40s than I ever did in my 20s or in my teens. Yeah. I wasn't a fan of long distance running. I would always do sprint training. And so over the past, I don't know, 3 or 4 months, I've been running 4 miles, whatever. I was doing that, I want to say 3 or 4 times a week. I'd run like 4 miles, maybe 4 or 5 miles. But in my prime, I weren't doing any of that. I was just doing sprint training, boxing training and stuff. Cal says I could run faster with the police behind me back in the days. Oh wow, Godo says Dr. Bennett, the same doctor who discovered CTE in NFL players, said Benoit had the brain of an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient with significant damage. That may be true, but I do wonder, because of how prevalent steroid use is in the WWE even now, I do wonder whether there might be an effort to downplay the effects of roids. Do you know what I mean? I do wonder whether there might be an effort to downplay the effects of roids. And as I understand it, the roids back in the days had more serious side effects than the stuff they use now. And I've heard this from people that are long-time roid users, like Mickey Theo, for example. I saw him on a podcast, and he said the roids that they had back in the 80s and the early 90s had much more like dramatic effects on his mood and his personality than the newer roids and whatnot. Blue Collar Sports TV says, what do you make of Adalai versus Hrgovic? Weird fight, but a risk worth taking for Adalai, in my opinion. If he loses, his career status doesn't really change. I agree with you. I think Hrgovic should win the fight. He should win it comfortably. But from Adalai's perspective, yeah, it's a risk worth taking. I'm assuming he's getting a career high payday. And he says it's a fight that he's been calling for behind the scenes. He's been asking Frank Warren for that fight. Maybe he sparred him and did well. I'm not sure. But yeah, from Adalai's perspective, it's a risk worth taking because he could have taken the TKV rematch and conceivably lost. And then where would he be? So rather than taking the TKV rematch, take on Hrgovic instead. If he loses the fight, well, he was expected to lose. So, do you know what I mean? It's not so much of a blow to his career. It would have been a much bigger blow to lose to TKV. Shout out to Lawrence for the super chat. He says, yeah, could be an effort to downplay roids. Also, McMahon and WWE involved with some dark stuff. And there are a lot of weird things with the Benoit death. Indeed. I watched the McMahon documentary on Netflix. I'm obviously aware that it's kind of a, could I call it a propaganda piece to some extent? Not that it's full of stuff that's totally untrue about McMahon, but you do have to bear in mind that Netflix now air WWE shows after Vince McMahon left. So it's that documentary was almost like an attempt by Netflix to distance themselves from McMahon. Do you know what I mean? And the new guy who runs WWE now also distancing himself from the old guard, the McMahon guard at WWE. That was my take on what that documentary was really all about and why they made it. Tia Gata says, do you think The Rock ever popped steroids? I mean, I'd be amazed if he didn't. I'd be amazed if any of the major WWE stars were not on roids. I mean, maybe some of the smaller ones possibly weren't on roids. And I think of Shawn Michaels, was he on roids? I mean, he might have been, but he wasn't that big, you know? But the likes of Hogan, he admitted to being on roids. Chris Benoit, obviously. Ultimate Warrior. The Rock, Stone Cold. I mean, with Stone Cold, it's conceivable that he might not have been. because although he was big, he wasn't that ripped, right? And he was never really crazy big. But with The Rock, now The Rock must have been roided up to the eyeballs, bro. And as somebody said there, The Rock is likely using more gear now than ever. Yeah, I reckon so. A shout out to Lawrence for the super chat. He says, I remember with Benoit's death, it was on Wikipedia before it happened. It was in the news with the exact same crime. Oh, wow. Is that the case? It was on Wikipedia before it happened. Wow. That's very sinister if that's true. Triple R says Ric Flair drank a lot, but said he never did roids or sniff. Well, professional wrestlers are also professional BS artists. Like whenever you hear these wrestlers tell their stories, it's like they're never out of character. They're always like exaggerating and BSing. Do you know what I mean? So I would take what Ric Flair said in that regard with a pinch of salt. If he never took nose candy, we'll call it, I can't prove that he did, but if he never did, I'd be amazed, because he certainly acted like somebody who was coked up to the eyeballs. Whenever he did his promos and stuff like that, I mean, dear oh dear. I would have assumed he was like Tony Montana backstage, you know, like dipping his whole face into a mountain of coke. That's what I would have imagined the Nature Boy Ric Flair was like backstage. You know what I mean? Like, his promos are crazy, bro. He was so red in the face and bright lights, pretty women, and you know that famous promo he did. I was born with a silver spoon, a golden spoon even. Woo, and all that. Man was like the poster boy for what you would imagine a cokehead would be. Oh, wow. Lawrence King says, yes, the English Wikipedia article about Chris Benoit was edited to include information about his wife's death before police discovered the bodies. A user added a statement mentioning. Very mysterious. That's the one. That's right, Exactamundo. Yeah. Limousine riding. Kiss stealing. That's right. Son of a gun. The alligator shoes just can't stop walking. Ric Flair, the Nature Boy. All right, Wave said he witnessed two gangs having a massive fight in Finsbury Park. Okay. It happens. Samil says, Hatman, which wild animal scares you? The ones that can kill humans. There's plenty of those, right? Especially the ones with sharp teeth. Or fangs that inject venom. You know? Oh, wow. Danny says WWE stars used to have a clause in their contract where they couldn't break character in public. Is that right? That's interesting. It makes sense, I guess. Makes sense. Especially back in the days, it made sense. All right, peeps, I'm going to bring this stream to an end. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Special shout out to those who donated via Super Chat. They were Matt Borgerson, Lawrence King, George the Last Poet, Rep 2016, Costanza versus Kramer, Richard Serban, Brad, Adam Fawkes, and Mr. Luca. And shout out to everyone else who joined the conversation. It's been great as usual. Until next time, take care, be good. I'll catch you on the other side. I'm out.